The message that I'm focused on today is praising God in the storm. And in order for us to praise God, we have to reflect on the things that He's done, reflect on who He is, His character, His promises, His faithfulness, His sovereignty, His glory. So I'm doing a couple of things, or a few things. I'm thinking back into my own experiences of what He's done with me. I'm asking others to share their stories, and I'm reading the Word. I wanted to share with you a few stories that have been shared with me regarding miracles that God has performed in different people's lives. The first one says, one of the many that initially comes to mind for me was the storm that we just had. There was destruction all around us, but we were not touched. I had the tree that for all intents and purposes should have come down in that storm, but did not. The branches on the trees that should have come down on the power lines, but did not. Everyone around us was without Wi-Fi, but we didn't lose service once. All of that is God's glory and protection. There are many more experiences throughout my life. That's just the most recent. So this person had, by the way, a tree right outside of their house that needed to be cut down regardless of an ice storm. But then Oregon had this terrible ice storm that came through that they're not really equipped for because it's not something that's typical. And a tree that if it fell, that was already a danger, but if it fell, was going to basically split their half of their house. People all around them lost power, lost Wi-Fi. They didn't lose anything. And this is a mom. This is a mom alone with her two boys. But God is a father to the fatherless, and He's a husband to the widow. And He protected her and her two boys and her house. The other one says, one that sticks out to me is when I was 18 years old, I prayed that God would get me away from the partying lifestyle, and then I became pregnant. Although I didn't completely return to God at that time, she was a miracle. I definitely identify with that. Getting pregnant with my daughter changed my life. I only wish that I had, been drawn to Christ sooner, but that's really according to Him. Another shared that when I prayed for His will to change my job because I was suffering and not able to find something else and wanted to just quit, He literally made it happen so easily, and I knew 100% it was Him, and it was a miracle, really. I mean, no interview, just handed to me. I also remember this person praying at that time that she just wanted to be able to spend more time with God. So it wasn't just that she was miserable at her job, but she wanted more time with God. And within the same company, a position opened up, and she was given that position. The other thing she talked about was being so sick all the time, quote unquote, depressed and anxiety, you name it. I was labeled, and it's now almost a year, and no doctor's medicine or those labels. Then she says, I also love that I've prayed for truth, and little did I know He'd been working with Carrie and used her to get me here. This one is huge because I sat in undergrad with Carrie, and I know she went on to higher education and then gave it all up to help us find truth. And she also said, and constantly He shows us how when natural disasters, quote unquote, hit, how often you'll find examples of His Passover. He literally passes over homes, people, towns, etc. Another says, when I moved back to Michigan from Pennsylvania, we were on the Ohio Turnpike, roughly 130 plus miles from home. The van ran out of gas, and the emergency light came on, but we kept driving, and I made it home to Michigan. When I've looked into it 20 years ago, the E-light gave about 30 miles before your car can't go any further. We drove over 100 plus miles and got there safely. I have always known that God did that. He defied so much human, quote unquote, understanding in that. Then another talked about the most intense experience that I'll never forget is when I was in Santa Barbara during the Isla Vista massacre. She and her friend had plans for the entire day to walk to this pizza place for dinner. They got ready to go out, showered, makeup, hair, and everything. And they literally were about to walk out of the door and decided to stay in and eat at the apartment. A few minutes later, they heard gunshots and found out that the guy had shot every girl he saw walking on her street and then shut up the pizza place. So some other things that we've experienced in my family. That story was actually my daughter. We had a fire in 2012 that began in the light fixture above my daughter's bed, and we had been gone that night. And had we been home, she probably would have been trapped in her room. Being a teenager, she probably would have been taking a nap or something and been trapped in that room. It's not as though God is not sovereign over the fire, like he didn't send the fire. I know why he sent the fire. I know the way that I was living at that time. But he sent the fire to get my butt in gear and also spared my daughter. He only brings the grief that he needs to bring, but he does bring it to get our attention. And it's a pretty profound metaphor when you think about him burning down your house. Some other things that I've thought about over the years were, I was a young single mom, not even 20. I think I was probably 18, and I'd been working at a little diner as a hostess, and they had just started training me to wait tables, and I was barely making it. And my daughter and I were living in a little one-room studio house, duplex really, with a tiny little shower. I used to cut the shower curtain in half to cover the little entrance. Tiniest little shower. Thank goodness we were tiny. And I would have a bill due the next day that was, maybe $53 or something like that. And in an evening, and I still wasn't on regular waitressing shifts. I was just being trained to kind of cover the girls. And I'd have this bill due the next day, and I'd be wondering, how in the world am I going to make it? How am I going to do this, Lord? And I would normally make $50 in that shift, and I would make just the amount that I needed to cover that bill, that $53 to cover that bill. And I, didn't have a bank account at that time. I would just go and get my money order and send in the money order for that bill. And it's those little things. It doesn't have to be a huge thing, but those little things where you're hinging and you're just, like you're waiting on God and you're constantly, Lord, how am I going to do this? How am I going to do this? And I remember those being very important days, because when God came through with those little things, it was monumental. It was huge. There was no way that was just going to happen by chance. And then years later, him bringing me to the brink of death, 30 years in therapy, almost 30 years in therapy, 7 years in medicine, and all the treatments money could buy, and couldn't get rid of what I now understand was a spirit of fear, attacking my mind, attacking my body. And here God tells me, clean out your cupboards, get rid of all of those supplements, everything that you've placed before me, whether it's the teas, every single thing, right? Oh, this tea heals this herb and this tincture and this magnet, this massage, acupuncture, all of these things that I had. I was telling someone earlier today that I had an egg carton, like those plastic egg cartons, and that egg carton would last me. So there was enough in there for, I think, 16 eggs. And I would put all of my medications and my supplements in there, and it would last about 3 days. I could portion them out for 3 days. That's how many pills I was taking in a day. And he had me throw every single thing out so that there was nothing. He was not going to give his glory to anything. And even as I say that, I realize right now, he was not going to give his glory to anything. And he has really reduced me to nothing. And there's nothing that I could possibly rely on right now but God. I'm back to, I was going to say, I'm back to the days of being 18 and, wondering, okay, am I going to be able to make this bill? But at least when I was 18, I had a job. I had income. I don't have any income now. And I have so many responsibilities. So he's reduced me to nothing. But see, that's what he does. That's what he wants to do, because he wants to reveal his glory and he wants you to know that he's God. How many times does he say it in the Bible, by the way? And in 6 months, within 6 months of me sitting and repenting with him and him waking me up at 4:30 every morning, I'd go and sit on my back patio table and I would journal and I would sit with him and I would pray and I would just hang on him, hang on his every word. And he healed me within 6 months. What 30 years of therapy could not do, what 7 years of every type of medicine that you can imagine could not even touch, he healed it. He healed it without anything. Because what happens when you have one little thing? Then you start saying, oh, God gave me this healing. God healed me. But you know what really helped? nuzzling this little quarter, right? I mean, like something so stupid. This is what healed me, nuzzling this little quarter. I just nuzzled this quarter every night when I went to sleep. I'm just thinking of something random and stupid because everything that we do is pretty random and stupid when you consider the fact that only God can heal. I mean, I've heard of people doing worse things like taking poisons that damage their entire body and then being like, oh, gonna get rid of this cancer. How? How are you gonna get rid of that cancer when you're killing everything good inside of you? I've heard of people being more delusional than to think that rubbing their cheek on a quarter is gonna heal them. In fact, I think we were all that delusional. So the other thing that I'm doing today is I'm looking at the Exodus. I'm looking at that story because that story always just, I mean, you can't even deny. I mean, this is where God made a name for himself. You can't deny it. Not that people won't, but I mean, if you have any sense whatsoever, you won't. And so I'm just pulling out these pieces of this story. And actually, I kind of appreciate that God led me to do that because there are some things that I hadn't even realized. So I want to share them with you. So I'm not going to read consistently from Exodus 12, but I'm going to read what is some things that I pulled out of the book of Exodus. Starting in the 12th chapter at the 29th verse, it says, at midnight, the Lord struck down all the firstborn in Egypt. Who can do that, guys? Who can do that? I don't know any disease or plague that says, I'm only going to strike down the firstborn of every household. But at midnight, this is what happened. The Lord struck down all the firstborn in Egypt, not of the Israelite households, spared the Israelite households, so don't talk to me about your masks and your gloves and your goggles that protect you. From the firstborn of Pharaoh who sat on the throne to the firstborn of the prisoner who was in the dungeon, and the firstborn of all the livestock as well. I mean, that's a pretty specific virus if we're talking about, so-called natural phenomenon. Pharaoh and all his officials and all the Egyptians got up during the night, and there was a loud wailing in Egypt. For there was not a house without someone dead. Now listen to this. During the night, Pharaoh summoned Moses and Aaron and said, up, leave my people, you and the Israelites. Go, worship the Lord as you have requested. Take your flocks and herds as you have said and go. And also bless me. So here Pharaoh releases them. He lets them go. His heart is softened by God, but it'll be hardened again. In verse 35, the Israelites did as Moses instructed and asked the Egyptians for articles of silver and gold and for clothing. The Lord had made the Egyptians favorably disposed toward the people, and they gave them what they asked for, so they plundered the Egyptians. And verse 40, now the length of the time the Israelite people lived in Egypt was 430 years. At the end of the 430 years, to the very day, so the anniversary of 430 years. Is that just chance, guys? To the very day, all the Lord's divisions left Egypt. And recently as I was studying, I realized that he did the same exact thing with bringing them into the promised land. It was 40 years to the day that they left Egypt. He brought them to the promised land. Who can do that? Who has that plan? Who is sovereign over that plan? But God. Commemorate this day, the day you came out of Egypt, out of the land of slavery, because the Lord brought you out of it with his mighty hand. So what I'm trying to demonstrate here is that God wants us to remember what he's done, who he is, who he was, and who he's being revealed to be. So do you think that he might draw our attention to it? Do you think that when we're going through something, if we start throwing a tantrum, that's going to get things done? Or do you think that we might need to turn to him? As I'm learning today, I need to turn and praise him and remember who he was, who he is, and who he's being revealed to be. And that I need to step back and go, oh, I'm an offering here. I'm not the boss. And being an offering has never been comfortable. Last I checked, the throat is slit, the blood is drained out, and it's laying on an altar to be burned. It's not comfortable. Commemorate this day, the day you came up out of Egypt, out of the land of slavery, because the Lord brought you out of it with his mighty hand. So we are always to remember him and what he has done. He was, he is, and he is to come. He's being revealed to us. He doesn't need us. It's his good pleasure to use us for his glory, and then he will bless in accordance with what his will is. Verse 6, for 7 days eat bread made without yeast, and on the seventh day hold a festival to the Lord. Why is he telling you to do this? I'm going to tell you. Eat unleavened bread during those 7 days. Nothing with yeast is to be in it is to be seen among you, nor shall any yeast be seen anywhere within your borders. On that day, tell your son, I do this because of what the Lord did for me when I came out of Egypt. This observance will be for you like a sign on your hand and a reminder on your forehead that this is the law of the Lord. This law of the Lord is to be on your lips. For the Lord brought you out of Egypt with his mighty hand. You must keep this ordinance at the appointed time year after year. Gosh, wonder how he feels about Easter. Here's Passover, where he made a name for himself. He brought the Israelites up out of Egypt with his mighty hand. He performed all of these miracles. He wanted us to know who he is. Then he sends his son to extend the covenant on Passover and to die, and we turn it into a bunny. Oh, how sweet. A bunny. A pagan holiday lifted up to a false god Ishtar. You guys weren't raised doing all this, were you? Eat unleavened bread, eat lamb the first night, remembering the story of how God brought the Israelites out of Egypt, how they left in haste without enough time to add yeast to their bread. These are the things that God established in order to what? So that we would remember, so that we would commemorate this day, the day that he brought the Israelites out of Egypt, out of the land of slavery. Now, if you're doing this, are you going to remember the significance of this in your own life? Are you going to remember when he brought you out of the land of slavery, out of the bondage that you sold yourself to? The other night, God actually kept talking to me about Passover in my sleep, and I didn't really want to acknowledge it, to be honest. In a way, like not entirely, but I was like, please don't make me wait till Passover for you to do this. Please don't make me wait. And, you know, he doesn't have to do things on particular dates. Most of the time he doesn't, unless there's a reason for him doing it. But certainly what I am going through right now, he is preparing us for Passover because Passover is coming up. No, not according to the Gregorian calendar. According to God's calendar, Passover is coming. It'll be on the 14th of God's month. I believe that February 11th or 12th is going to be the new moon. Let's see. Well, I'm still trying to discern this. I'm still trying to understand when does the crescent, because there's no documentation, at least online, of when the crescent actually shows up. Everything that's documented in terms of timestamp is the dark moon, which they're calling the new moon. That's not the new moon. The new moon is the crescent. The first quarter, the full moon, and the last quarter. So you don't get timestamps on the crescent. So it's very difficult to try to understand. Now, in biblical times, you would have had a rooster letting you know, like, that it was coming up because they were very sensitive to that. Now you have a rooster, you better live in a very, very rural area. Otherwise, that rooster is going to respond to everything and you're not going to know what's going on. You're just going to think, man, that rooster crows all the time because they respond to car lights and other roosters and threat and predators and, all kinds of stuff. But if you were living in open fields, you would know because the rooster would let you know. You would have been anticipating at a certain point that moon was going to come up. So around the 29th day from the previous new moon, you're going to start looking, okay, half a day, that rooster is going to crow and you're going to see the next new moon, or the next crescent moon, new moon come up. And then you would know, okay, a Sabbath has begun. And if it happened in the morning, then you would know until just before evening that you were to observe your new moon Sabbath. And then the next day would begin. And that would be a work day. It might actually be a joy to have something like that. Oh, here's the new moon. Now let's go rest. Time to go rest in God. Here's a new month. Now, for some reason, it's such an inconvenience to people. So then verse 20, after leaving Succoth, they camped at Etham on the edge of the desert. By day, the Lord went ahead of them in a pillar of cloud to guide them on their way, and by night, a pillar of fire to give them light, so that they could travel by day or night. Neither the pillar of cloud by day nor the pillar of fire by night left its place in front of the people. So there's this demonstration of care that God gave the Israelites, keeping them sheltered that whole time, always being right there. It kind of reminds me of when he says, like, when you go through the waters or the fire, I'm going to be with you. Just always watching over them and always protecting them, literally with a pillar of cloud and a pillar of fire. And then in verse 4, and I will harden Pharaoh's heart and he will pursue them. But I will gain glory for myself through Pharaoh and all his army, and the Egyptians will know that I am the Lord. So the Israelites did this. And here, you see that God he's the one who softens Pharaoh's heart. He's the one who hardens Pharaoh's heart. And that all of this is part of his plan. And so as much as I'm going through right now, this is all part of his plan. There's nothing that God's not sovereign over. He knows exactly what he's doing. He knows exactly who I am in him, who he has made me to be in him, not who I am just naturally because I decided to be, but who he's made me to be in him, how he's going to reveal his glory through me and through the crushing. Then in verse 13, Moses answered the people, do not be afraid, stand firm, and you will see the deliverance the Lord will bring you today. The Egyptians you see today, you will never see again. The Lord will fight for you. You need only be still. You hear the words of Moses? The Lord will fight for you. You need only be still. So you need only be still, and believe that is implied. Verse 16, raise your staff and stretch out your hand over the sea to divide the water so that the Israelites can go through the sea on dry ground. I will harden the hearts of the Egyptians so they will go in after them, and I will gain glory through Pharaoh and all his army, through his chariots and his horsemen. The Egyptians will know that I am the Lord when I gain glory through Pharaoh, his chariots, and his horsemen. And verse 19, then the angel of God who had been traveling in front of Israel's army withdrew and went behind them. The pillar of cloud also moved from in front and stood behind them, coming between the armies of Egypt and Israel. Throughout the night, the cloud brought darkness to one side and light to the other side, so neither went near the other all night long. Then Moses stretched out his hand over the sea, and all that night the Lord drove the sea back with a strong east wind and turned it into dry land. The waters were divided, and the Israelites went through the sea on dry ground, with a wall of water on their right and on their left. The Egyptians pursued them, and all Pharaoh's horses and chariots and horsemen followed them into the sea. During the last watch of the night, the Lord looked down from the pillar of fire and cloud at the Egyptian army and threw it into confusion. He jammed the wheels of their chariots so that they had difficulty driving. And the Egyptians said, let's get away from the Israelites. The Lord is fighting for them against Egypt. Then the Lord said to Moses, stretch out your hand over the sea so that the waters may flow back over the Egyptians and their chariots and horsemen. Moses stretched out his hand over the sea, and at daybreak the sea went back to its place. The Egyptians were fleeing toward it, and the Lord swept them into the sea. The water flowed back and covered the chariots and horsemen, the entire army of Pharaoh that had followed the Israelites into the sea. Not one of them survived. Not one survived. Not one of the enemies of God's people. But the Israelites went through the sea on dry ground with a wall of water on their right and on their left. That day, the Lord saved Israel from the hands of the Egyptians, and Israel saw the Egyptians lying dead on the shore. And when the Israelites saw the mighty hand of the Lord displayed against the Egyptians, the people feared the Lord and put their trust in him and in Moses, his servant. You know, one of the things I'm reminded of as I'm reading this is I think about, my goodness, like, look at the people who, dropped off, who, didn't believe. Then they're going through the wilderness and they quickly forget all of the things that God has done. And I'm thinking about, what God did with my little grandson, Jeremiah, and with my daughter, that, first of all, my daughter wasn't supposedly supposed to be able to have any babies. That's what medicine told her years ago, that she wouldn't be able to have babies. So she had already grieved that. Both her and her husband had already grieved that. And she immediately got pregnant with Jeremiah after their wedding. It had to have been within days of their wedding because of how quickly her pregnancy came up, 4 weeks after the wedding. So my daughter was pregnant with this little baby, and the kids had still not quite come out of medicine. My daughter had a real natural birth plan and everything else, and her doctor was very respectful of that at first, and then slowly started with these tricks that they do in medicine, where they'll be like, well, don't you want me to induce? Don't you want me to be the person who's delivering your baby? And my daughter was like, yeah, that's not that important to me. Like, what's important to me is when God brings the baby. I'm not trying to get induced just because, like, you think you're important. And then they started doing these fear-mongering things that they do so that she would get a C-section, so that she would get an induction, telling her that, he was going to die. There were indeed actually things that they were picking up on that were true. I actually didn't know that the entire time. In part, I thought that they were manipulating, but there were issues going on with the amniotic fluid. The placenta was failing. It was calcifying. They were saying that his heart rate was going down, a lot of different things. And they were telling her that he was likely going to die and that she could very well die if she didn't do what they told her to do. And even though she was at a Christian hospital at a Christian university, and she said, I'm going to go home and pray, I don't make these decisions at the moment. I go and seek God. And they said, oh, yeah, I'm Christian too, but what? But what? Medicine knows better? God isn't capable? What is the but? And my daughter said to me at a certain point, she said that I think God's going to make me go to full term with this baby. And they had told her, well, if you go to 42 weeks, we're going to have to go in and we're going to have to go get that baby. Well, God brought her to 42 weeks and 1 day. And she had that baby without them. But I'll tell you, you leave that little crack open for the devil. And it's going to make life a lot more difficult. It's going to make standing with God a lot more difficult because you're going to hear these lies of the world that are so prevalent. And then you're going to read about what God says, which is the truth, that he is the Lord, your healer. And you're going to wonder which one's true because you're hearing these things far more prevalently than you're actually seeing people live this out. No one's living the truth out. Are you kidding me? Everyone's submitting to these idols. And I think about that story and how there were certain people who were fasting with us during that time who are no longer here. They saw it. They heard it. They listened to me sobbing about this. They knew what was going on. Some of the things that I wasn't even sharing on the channel. They knew every single thing that was going on at that time. And that God brought baby Jeremiah to birth, a healthy little baby boy, a healthy mom, who healed faster than anybody I've ever seen be butchered by medicine. She certainly healed faster than I did, and I was 17 when I had her. But I was submitting to medicine, and I got chopped up like carnage. God has made everything good with this mama and this baby. And of course he has. He's been doing it for thousands of years. He wove that baby together in her womb. But see, counterfeit Christianity will say things like that, and then they'll be like, oh, but you can't have a non-medicalized birth. God isn't capable of doing that. Well, he could. He could, but what if something happens? Right. He wouldn't be sovereign over that too. And it just blows me away that those people are no longer here. They saw that miracle. But see, people who do not believe are always going to make that golden calf. Your pearls will be trampled by swine if you continue to waste your time with people who don't love truth. How many died? How many were eliminated during that time as the Israelites were traveling through the wilderness? How many people had to be cleaned out of the body? So there's a lot here that God is doing during this time in my offering and in cleaning out the body, isn't he? He's getting rid of those who really aren't in this. As we're traveling through this wilderness, they can't really be bothered to actually do the things, It's all fine and dandy when God is doing it, but when we have to do it, it's a different story, isn't it? When we're being called to give account for who we've been, for what we're doing, totally different story. And I'll tell you another thing, is that all of that was going on with Jeremiah during the season of Passover. This year, this is what's going on. To keep bringing our attention into what God has called us to do, who he's called us to be, and to understand the fulfillment of his Passover. Chapter 15. Then Moses and the Israelites sang this song to the Lord. I will sing to the Lord, for he is highly exalted. Both horse and driver he has hurled into the sea. The Lord is my strength and my defense. He has become my salvation. He is my God, and I will praise him. My father's God, and I will exalt him. The Lord is a warrior. The Lord is his name. Pharaoh's chariots and his army he has hurled into the sea. The best of Pharaoh's officers are drowned in the Red Sea. The deep waters have covered them. They sank to the depths like a stone. Your right hand, Lord, was majestic in power. Your right hand, Lord, shattered the enemy. In the greatness of your majesty, you threw down those who opposed you. You unleashed your burning anger. It consumed them like stubble. By the blast of your nostrils, the waters piled up. The surging waters stood up like a wall. The deep waters congealed in the heart of the sea. The enemy boasted, I will pursue, I will overtake them, I will divide the spoils, I will gorge myself on them. I will draw my sword, and my hand will destroy them. But you blew with your breath, and the sea covered them. They sank like lead in the mighty waters. Who among the gods is like you, Lord? Who is like you, majestic in holiness, awesome in glory, working wonders? You stretch out your right hand, and the earth swallows your enemies. In your unfailing love, you will lead the people you have redeemed. In your strength, you will guide them to your holy dwelling. The nations will hear and tremble. Anguish will grip the people of Philistia. The chiefs of Edom will be terrified. The leaders of Moab will be seized with trembling. The people of Canaan will melt away. Terror and dread will fall on them. By the power of your arm, they will be still as stone until your people pass by, Lord, until the people you bought pass by. You will bring them in and plant them on the mountain of your inheritance, the place, Lord, you made for your dwelling, the sanctuary, Lord, your hands established. The Lord reigns forever and ever. When Pharaoh's horses, chariots, and horsemen went into the sea, the Lord brought the waters of the sea back over them, but the Israelites walked through the sea on dry ground. Then Miriam, the prophet, Aaron's sister, took a timbrel in her hand, and all the women followed her with timbrels and dancing. Miriam sang to them, Sing to the Lord, for he is highly exalted. Both horse and driver he has hurled into the sea. Then Moses led Israel from the Red Sea, and they went into the desert of Shur. For 3 days they traveled the desert without finding water. When they came to Marah, they could not drink its water because it was bitter. This is why the place is called Marah. So the people grumbled against Moses, saying, What are we to drink? Then Moses cried out to the Lord, and the Lord showed him a piece of wood. He threw it into the water, and the water became fit to drink. There the Lord issued a ruling and instruction for them and put them to the test. He said, If you listen carefully to the Lord your God and do what is right in his eyes, if you pay attention to his commands and keep all his decrees, I will not bring on you any of the diseases I brought on the Egyptians, for I am the Lord who heals you. Who heals? Who brings diseases? Who heals? Who brings diseases? The Lord does all those things. Then they came to Elim, where there were 12 springs and 70 palm trees, and they camped there near the water. God's the one who heals. He is the one who does all these things. And do you think that by that time, after he's done all of this in our own lives, in the Word, if these are the things that we believe, can we believe that he will heal, that he will provide, that he will protect, that he will pass over, but only for those who regard him, only for those who submit to him, who believe in him, who stand in that faith, even to the end, even when it seems totally hopeless. My situation right now, for all intents and purposes, seems totally hopeless. But I know who I've been in him. I know that I have obeyed, and I do believe in his promises, and I do believe in who he was, who he is, and who he's being revealed to be. Now listen, I'm going through one of the hardest times in my life, and I get on here and I give you a message of encouragement every single day. That's what I do with my struggles. That's what I do with my pain. I am an offering to you every single day. I would appreciate it if you would post in the comment section a testimony of encouragement for the rest of the body, for the rest of everyone else on this channel. If you would take the time to post a testimony of encouragement about what God has done in your life. How do you praise him in the storm? It's essential in our covenant that we're being used by God as an offering. So I hope you'll take the opportunity to do that.